The night sky over Europe in the winter of 1944 carried a strange kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, something waiting. Beneath that darkness, a lone American bomber limped through the clouds, trailing smoke like a wounded animal dragging its last breath. Inside the ruined aircraft, a young pilot named Daniel Mercer felt the heat of the burning engine through the soles of his boots as he fought to keep what little control he had left. The gauges flickered like dying stars. Rivulets of hydraulic fluid pulsed across the floor. Half his crew was unconscious. One was dead, and the only thing keeping the plane aloft was sheer willpower and a fading prayer whispered between clenched teeth. What Daniel did not know was that 2 enemy fighters were already tracking him. What he also did not know was that these 2 men would become the most unlikely protectors of his life. Yet he would not discover their names, their histories, or the truth behind their actions until 79 years later, when time itself finally surrendered its secrets in the cold above East Germany. Captain Eric Weber and Lieutenant Jakob Ruttmann streaked through the air in their Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Their orders were simple: intercept any straggling bombers attempting to escape the aftermath of the Allied raid on Leipzig. Both men knew the war was turning. Fuel was scarce, losses were mounting, and the Luftwaffe was no longer the unstoppable force it once pretended to be. But duty was duty, and the Reich needed every bomber shot down. Yet beneath these straightforward orders lay tensions neither pilot dared to express aloud. Eric had seen enough in the East to know what obedience to the regime could cost a man's soul. Jakob had lost 2 brothers in the crumbling defensive lines around the Ruhr, and both men carried secrets that, in another world, would have branded them enemies of their own command structure. But in wartime, secrets often became survival. Daniel Mercer's B-17 began to drift lower, sinking toward the frozen fields below. His vision blurred as smoke seeped into the cockpit. He thought of home, of the warm Tennessee wind that moved through the apricot trees behind his family farmhouse, of the girl who promised she'd wait, of a life he couldn't imagine returning to with hands stained by death and the memory of explosions echoing through every heartbeat. War had carved something out of him, something he feared might never return. And as the bomber groaned under the weight of its own destruction, he wondered if the sky itself had finally chosen the moment to swallow him. He tightened his grip on the trembling control yoke, whispering the names of his crew like a ritual against oblivion. Below him, Eric Weber saw the bomber first. Through the frost-rimmed canopy of his cockpit, he watched the crippled giant stagger in the wind like a dying bird. Its left wing was torn deeply, one of the engines hanging by a single strut. He keyed his radio to Jakob, his voice steady but heavy with an unspoken conflict. They were trained to finish the kill swiftly, decisively. A damaged bomber was an opportunity of victory, a reassurance to their superiors that the Luftwaffe still held the skies. But as Eric drew closer, he noticed something that made the blood in his veins grow colder. The bomber was not maneuvering. It wasn't turning, diving, or returning fire. It was simply falling. Jakob came alongside him, matching speed. Through the static of the radio, he muttered that finishing this kill felt like shooting a man already on his knees. Eric said nothing at first, but his silence carried more weight than any command. He eased his fighter closer until he could see into the cockpit of the B-17, and there, amid shattered glass and fire-stained metal, he saw Daniel Mercer's young face smeared with soot and blood, eyes still determined, still fighting, still alive. Something inside Eric shifted. He later described it as a moment when the war cracked open just long enough for humanity to slip through. Daniel blinked, startled, as a sleek German fighter glided into view beside him. So close he could see the pilot's eyes beneath the visor. For a moment he braced for the final strike, tightening his jaw, prepared for the gunfire that would end everything in a flash of steel and fire. But the guns never fired. Instead, the German pilot nodded deliberately before pulling his aircraft upward in a protective arc, signaling shelter rather than destruction. What Daniel did not see was that Jakob positioned his fighter behind and above the bomber, scanning the skies for other Luftwaffe aircraft. If another German pilot arrived, they would assume the bomber was still a target. Eric and Jakob were not shielding the bomber from Daniel's enemies. They were now shielding it from their own allies. Beneath this strange aerial truce lay forces neither pilot fully understood. Earlier that year, after the collapse of the Sixth Army at the Obver, the once feared German military intelligence service, had begun pulling information from disillusioned officers, pilots among them. Many in the Luftwaffe privately feared that the war was lost, and some quietly shared intelligence with neutral diplomats in Switzerland. It was whispered that high-ranking officers, weary of Hitler's madness, were forming their own clandestine networks. These invisible webs of dissent created fractures in the German war machine that manifested in small, barely noticeable moments like hesitation during an engagement, or a refusal to follow an order that served propaganda more than survival. Eric Weber and Jakob Ruttmann were never formally involved in these conspiracies, but the same doubt that fueled them had taken root in their hearts. Daniel's bomber dipped again. Eric wagged his wings, an international signal meaning "follow me." Daniel wasn't sure if he should trust it, but trust was all he had left, and his dying aircraft responded less to steering than to gravity itself. He eased the bomber in the direction Eric indicated, drifting toward a layer of low cloud cover. Jakob flew above them, scanning for patrols, the tension in his muscles tightening with every passing second. If a German anti-air battery spotted them guiding an enemy bomber, all three aircraft, German and American, would be torn from the sky without hesitation as they descended. Daniel noticed the landscape changing. Frozen rivers snaked across the earth like veins of glass. Smoke from distant villages rose in thin grey columns. Somewhere down there was the shifting line between safety and death. Eric circled one last time, dipped his fighter's wings again, and then peeled away sharply, heading back toward German airspace before anyone could question his patrol route. Jakob hesitated a fraction longer, giving a small salute through the canopy, and then he too veered away into the fading winter light. Daniel's bomber continued to fall. He guided it as best he could until the wheels skimmed a barren field, the impact jarring through his bones. The aircraft skidded, tore across frozen soil, and came to a stop in a plume of snow and dirt. Daniel breathed for the first time in minutes, his vision swimming. Against all odds, he was alive. But survival, in war, often begins another kind of battle. When Allied forces found him hours later, Daniel tried to explain what had happened, but few believed him. Enemy fighters did not spare bombers, not intentionally. It sounded like the delirium of a man traumatized by fire and crash. The report filed into his case notes mentioned possible hallucination, and the war marched forward, swallowing his story like countless others lost to disbelief. Meanwhile, Eric and Jakob returned to base under a sky turning fiery orange. They said nothing about the incident. Silence, after all, was its own form of survival. But something in both men had shifted permanently. For Jacob, it was the first moment since his brothers died that he felt he had done something that belonged to him, not the regime. For Eric, it was proof that even in a collapsing world, a man could choose who he wanted to be. But the war swallowed them too. In April 1945, Jacob was shot down over the Elbe. His body was never recovered. Eric vanished amid the chaos of Germany's surrender, swept into the fog of post-war uncertainty like so many former pilots. Rumors placed him in a British POW camp. Others claimed he fled to Argentina. No one knew. Daniel Mercer returned home to a life that never felt entirely his again. He married, raised children, worked in a Tennessee factory, and spoke little about the day 2 German pilots saved his life. Not because he didn't remember, but because no one else did. For nearly 8 decades, his memory sat like a sealed door in the back of his mind. Whenever he looked at the sky at the streak of a plane cutting through the clouds, he felt a presence there, the phantom of a Messerschmitt flying beside him. Everything remained untouched until 2023, when a historian compiling records for a German aviation museum found a wartime journal belonging to a former Luftwaffe mechanic. Inside it were 2 brief entries referencing an incident involving a B-17 bomber guided away rather than destroyed, mentioning 2 names, Weber and Ruttmann. It was an anomaly, one small line contradicting the brutality expected of the air war. The historian traced the names, dug through archives long forgotten, sifted through personnel files, gathering dust in local administrative offices that once served the Reich. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth that Daniel had tried to share decades earlier began resurfacing. A genealogy researcher cross-referenced the names with Allied mission logs. One crashed B-17 stood out, a bomber forced into an emergency landing with a lone surviving pilot. The historian then searched US veterans' records. There was only one possible match: Daniel Mercer. The first letter arrived on Daniel's doorstep like a message sent forward through time. His hands shook as he opened it, reading the name Eric Weber for the first time in nearly 79 years. The letter explained that Eric was alive, 99 years old, living in a quiet village in Lower Saxony. He had spoken openly in recent years about a single act during the war that he believed defined his humanity, though he never knew whether the American pilot survived. He spoke of a bomber trailing smoke, of eyes he could never forget. He never expected the man in that cockpit to still be alive. Daniel set the letter down and stared at the wall, the memories flooding back with such force that he had to grip the table. He had always believed those pilots were real. Now he knew their names. Arrangements were made quietly, without media attention or spectacle. Daniel traveled with his granddaughter and a translator. Eric waited in a modest living room, warmed by soft afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. His hands were frail, his back curved, his eyes a pale blue that held nearly a century of weight. When Daniel entered the room, time paused it out of awe, but in recognition. 2 men who had once hovered at the edges of life and death now stood face to face, not as enemies, not as soldiers, but as the last surviving witnesses of their own story. Daniel approached slowly. He did not speak at first. Instead, he raised his hand in a trembling salute. Eric's breath hitched, and he lifted his own hand in return, the gesture bridging a gap of 79 years. They sat together, 2 old men surrounded by the echoes of a world that no longer existed. Daniel recounted the crash, the nod he saw through the cockpit glass, the moment he realized he had been spared. Eric listened with tears gathering at the edges of his eyes. Nodding as if hearing the final sentence of a book he began writing decades earlier. When Daniel asked about you, Eric closed his eyes, whispering the name like a prayer. He told Daniel how Jacob had insisted they protect the bomber, how he positioned himself above it in case other German fighters arrived. He told him how Jacob never made it home, how the war claimed him as it claimed millions. Daniel bowed his head, whispering a thank you meant for a man he never met but owed his life to. In that small room, the hidden dimensions of the war, the doubts, the quiet acts of defiance, the secret humanity buried beneath the uniforms rose to the surface. Eric revealed that after 1943, many pilots carried private doubts, whispered conversations at airfields hinting at the futility of the war. Some officers sabotaged intelligence reports, manipulated radar readings, or turned a blind eye during engagements. The Luftwaffe High Command noticed anomalized bombers spared for no tactical reason, patrols flying odd routes. They blamed inexperience, fatigue, engine problems. But beneath the excuses lay a truth too uncomfortable for the crumbling Reich. Not all German pilots believed the war was worth fighting anymore. Some simply wanted to go home with their souls intact. Daniel and Eric spoke for hours. They exchanged memories like pieces of a puzzle that had waited almost a century to be completed. When Eric admitted that he sometimes doubted whether sparing the bomber mattered in the long run, Daniel looked him in the eyes and said, "It mattered to me, and to everyone whose life grew from mine." Eric wept quietly, not from guilt or pride, but from the relief of knowing that the choice he made in the winter sky had rippled outward into generations. When the visit ended, the two men stood facing each other once more. Daniel placed his hand on Eric's shoulder. "You saved my life," he whispered. Eric replied, "No, we saved each other." The silence that followed felt sacred, as though the ghosts of their past stood around them, watching, remembering, forgiving. Daniel left Germany carrying not closure, but clarity. The war was not a story of nations, it was a story of individuals, of moments when a single choice defied the machinery of conflict. Eric passed away 3 months later, his family saying he left the world in peace. Daniel lived long enough to tell his story in full, ensuring Jakob's name was finally spoken, finally honored, finally remembered. And somewhere in the sky, high above the fields of East Germany, where fire once rained a bomber and 2 fighters still fly in formation, preserved not in war records or history books, but in the lives shaped by the men who chose mercy when the world expected blood.